Be sure your sins will find you out. This is unfortunate, and I feel like I need to say something because I have referenced my enjoyment of Neil Gaiman's books on this channel before, and how he encourages people to make good art on bad days when life is hard, when life is good. If you're interested in art, make good art. To be clear, I've enjoyed some of Neil Gaiman's books. We live in a drought of good prose. Modern publishing, there is, especially with self-publishing, there is just a decline in the quality of prose and writing. Neil Gaiman is a talented writer. I don't think he stands up there with Charles Dickens or Tolkien. I think he thinks he does. He doesn't. But he has good prose in this drought of good prose. And sometimes his stories are interesting or funny or clever. But I want to say this, I have always had some discomfort with some of his work. And I just want to sort of share that with you. And then I think, see that it makes sense as to why I had some discomfort with his work. Years back, I was working really hard, really long hours, and just between commuting and working, I'd come home and put on Elden Ring and listen to Neil Gaiman short stories in the background just to sort of unwind right before bed. And some of those stories were really good. They were sort of dark and mysterious, but had sort of a positive moral message to them or a clever twist at the end. But some of those stories, even in the same collection, I would skip because, disturbingly enough, I'm not a Puritan, but I do try to avoid pornography. And his prose would get pornographic. Not always, but occasionally. And that made me uncomfortable. But it got worse. There was one horror short story that the man wrote years back. It won awards. And I tried to read it. I couldn't finish it. And it wasn't because it was scary or, terrifying. It's because it was warped. It was perverted. It talked about things that would and should make your stomach churn. I have a friend I work with who, I'm not a Puritan, but I try to avoid certain things. My friend will let himself watch and read things that I probably wouldn't. He was deeply uncomfortable at the story. And I did ask myself the question, what kind of a mind would write things that he's writing? The reality is, it wasn't promoting it, but it was sort of talking about sexual acts involving children. Now, this is something I don't think should ever be used as entertainment. This is something we should not desensitize ourselves to. And what it seems to be in culture since the 90s is culture pushed further and further into shock value, just trying to shock us. And then that shock wears off, and then they move further and try to shock you into something else. But eventually, not much shocks you. But I think things like this should shock us. And then, me being me, I like comic books. I like Neil Gaiman's prose. I found out he wrote a comic book series called Sandman. It's very popular. And I think back in the 80s, this was a time when the Comic Code Authority went away. Comic book writers could do what they wanted. They started writing more and more dark stuff simply because they could. So Frank Miller would write what he wrote. Neil Gaiman would write what he wrote. I remember going to the bookstore and picking up the graphic novel of it. And I'm not judging you if you read it, but I remember flipping through it and thinking, man, I would really enjoy this. Take a Neil Gaiman comic book home and just read the stories because he sort of crafts an interesting story. And I flipped through it, and I remember again being uncomfortable. Not that this was pedophilic or anything non-consensual or whatever. It was just a bit pornographic at places. And I remember thinking, this isn't for me. I shouldn't be reading this, especially with these bad artist renderings. And I also thought, if my son finds this, this is not me being a good father and leading my son by example. So not only do I not need to be seeing this, I really don't want my son to think this is what his dad entertains himself with. I find myself at odds with my generation on this. So much of, when I was a boy, a young man would have to go looking for pornography actively. I feel like now I have to actively avoid pornography because it's everywhere. Now, I don't want you to think I'm perfect, I'm not better than you. I have my moral flaws and failings. But these are things that I do try to avoid, right? But Neil Gaiman seems to be pushing this. And listening to him over the years, he's pushed some of the same new atheist talking points. Not that this makes him perverted, but I just remember hearing him bash religion, promote freedom like this. And I think that this sexual liberation movement from the 60s is sort of what's in his head. But this is a false movement. Sexual liberation, if you mean women have the right to work and earn their own income, sure. If you mean promoting pornography in society, I think this has been bad for us. And then as this stuff has been promoted, we've torn down more and more walls, boundaries that our ancestors put up for good reason. This leads me to the accusations that keep piling on. I won't get into the details, but essentially multiple women who have worked for Neil Gaiman, and he says this was all, he doesn't deny some of the relationships, he just says that these were consensual. He was married at the time. Supposedly it was a so-called open marriage. That marriage has ended. And he would have these sexual acts with women that these women say they felt coerced because he had so much power and authority over them. Maybe they lived on his property, maybe they worked for him, he controlled so much of their lives. To me, that's bad enough. I mean, I won't get into the details, it's sort of sick. If they're true, he has a very sick mind, and he's power tripping. The latest accusation was just full on, just violent, terrible things. Now, I'm going to say allegedly he did these things because I don't know for sure. Sometimes false accusations do get made. I hope that he didn't, but it does seem increasingly likely that he's not a good man. And then tie that into, if this is the case of what he's doing, tie that into the mind of a man who writes things involving children. I think you sort of see a connection. This is not a man who practices restraint in a virtuous way. I think so many celebrities are it's just obvious, wicked people. And in the sexual liberation movement coming out of, the 60s into the 90s, a lot of these folks have been getting away with things that is not just, gross, immoral, but consensual, which is immoral in its own right. These people have been abusers, and because of their money, power, status, they've had very little or no accountability. This has to change. These are often the same people who will blast religious leaders for being, abusive. And if a religious leader is abusive, if it's an evangelical pastor or a Catholic priest, if they abuse children or women, they need to be held accountable. But if it's a Hollywood celebrity, they need to be held accountable. It seems pretty obvious there are still a lot of pervs in the world, a lot of wicked people, and we need justice. We need a society that promotes virtue and not just hedonism. Not a society that just promotes power, money, wealth, without consequences, but really restraint, virtue, charity, things like this. This does remind me of something I think is very true. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. The things that we do in this life really matter, for good or for bad. For all the good things he's written, it seems to me he has a perverted mind. Not a good role model. So I'm just going to reread Tolkien. That's it for now. Take care of yourself. Bye.